Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. Grade school or high school, one time or another, all of us memorized those lines. Being young, we didn't think much about what they really meant. If we did think about what Lincoln was trying to tell us that day at Gettysburg, we did so with complacency. The Union had been tested, as Lincoln put it, and had passed with a grade of A+. A nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal could endure, had in fact endured. Government of, by, and for the people had not perished from the earth. And such is the short perspective of the young. But we, and I speak particularly of my own generation, the baby boomers, we've gotten older, we've lived longer, we've read a little history, gained some perspective, we've even lived some history, and we now know that free government is not tested only once. It's tested repeatedly, perhaps not in every generation, but repeatedly it is tested. And so it came to pass on the 6th of June, 1944, that government of, by, and for the people was tested again. And just as the supreme test of the Civil War had come at the foot of a bluff near Gettysburg, so the supreme test of World War II came at the foot of a bluff on a beach in Normandy. By 8 a.m. that morning, the epic landing was over. 5,000 Americans were ashore on Omaha Beach, but they were hunkered down behind a seawall, cringing under a hail of German fire pouring down on them from the bluff above. According to the D-Day plan, they were already supposed to have been climbing that bluff, making their way up the footpaths and ravines by no later than 7:30. At 8:30, the approaches to the beach were still sealed shut. Our boys couldn't get close to them. The defenses were just too strong for human flesh to overcome, or so it seemed. Stephen Ambrose, in his book on D-Day, says that the Americans were caught half on and half off of the beach. They couldn't reinforce, they couldn't withdraw. And he tells us they had just been through a baptism of fire that was heart-stopping. They were at 50% strength or less without unit cohesion. They were exhausted, frightened, confused, wounded, and they were scared boys. The average GI on that beach was just 20 years old. The decisive moment had come, and no great leader in London or Washington, no general at headquarters, no admiral aboard ship could make a bit of difference. And then something happened. Along Omaha Beach, here, there, over this way, over that, a squad, maybe a platoon, maybe just a couple of soldiers, checked the ammo in their clips and slapped them home and tightened their helmet straps and stood up from behind that seawall. They started across the beach toward the bluff, not because some general waved a flag or gave a command, not because there was a trumpet sound, but men alone or in small groups just decided, we have to get over that beach and we have to get up that bluff, so they stood up and they started. Some of them were bobbing and ducking and weaving, some of them were crawling, some of them were just walking upright. Many of them were leaning forward with their heads bent as if they were walking through a storm. And they were. It was a storm of lead. Some years after the war was over, historian Stephen Ambrose induced Sergeant Warner Hamlet to give him a recorded oral history of everything Hamlet had seen and done that day. Hamlet told how he and his buddies got over the seawall, made it to the foot of the bluff, and were pinned down there by German machine gun fire that was directed at them from concrete bunkers, pillboxes. And Hamlet told how we decided to run between the pillboxes and get into the trenches that connected them. We entered the trenches, ran behind the pillboxes, and threw grenades into them. After the explosion, we'd run into the pillbox to shoot any survivors. Rows upon rows of pillboxes stood between us and the top of the bluff. One by one, slowly we advanced. The bravery and gallantry of the soldiers was beyond belief. Hamlet was wounded in the leg and back, and when he got to the top of the bluff, he tells us, Sergeant England told me to go back down to the beach, find a medic who'd tag me so I could be transported back to a hospital ship. And as I made my way slowly back to the shore, I found that it was lined with thousands of parts of bodies floating in the tide. Heads, arms, legs. I realized what being in the first wave was all about. Hamlet concluded his oral history. I was in the hospital in England for 2 months. After that, they sent me back to the front lines. In all, I saw 7 months of combat and was wounded twice more. I would do it all over again to stop someone like Hitler. I am Warner H. Hamlet. Every time that free government comes to a life or death test, we get to that moment because of our own natural human tendency not to look reality in the eye for just as long as possible. We vote for candidates who tell us that whatever the problem is, we don't need to do anything serious about it right now. Before the Civil War, they said we don't have to try and solve the slavery situation right now. Before World War II, they said we don't need to do anything about Hitler right now. And I can remember back in the 60s and 70s when they said, oh, we don't need to run off and do something rash about inflation right now. It'll all take care of itself. And if it doesn't take care of itself, then we can take care of it at a more opportune moment, a moment when we're completely ready, a moment that somehow is never supposed to come around until after the next election. Indeed, they often tell us it won't come for decades. We'll all be dead and in our graves, and the problem will just fall to some other generation. And every time we take that bad advice, it brings us to a moment of testing. And at that moment of testing, you know, the same thing happens every time. The columnists, the pundits, the professoriate, the deep thinkers all declare that this time democracy is done for. This time we're going under. They say it out loud for the whole world to hear them. They print it for the whole world to read it. And you know, a lot of our office holders, in silence, agree with them. And we, the people, are always shocked to discover in a crisis how few of our leaders have any faith in us and any faith in self-government. In every test, from slavery to the Civil War to the Great Depression to defeating the great tyrannies of the 20th century to breaking the back of inflation in the 70s and 80s, the pattern is always the same. Put it off just as long as possible until you get to a place where you have only two choices. One is to make great and painful sacrifices, and the other one to go under. And every time the wise men telling us that this time Americans will not make the sacrifices, this time America and free government will go under. It's 234 years since our fathers brought forth a republic, and now we face another test to determine whether that government can endure much longer. There is a peril that we have allowed to develop and mount through 80 years, a peril we have no choice now but to confront, and that peril is national bankruptcy. As the slavery issue was coming to a head, Lincoln gave his House Divided speech. And it started with these words: if we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could then better judge what to do and how to do it. Well, whither are we tending? We are engaged once more in a great civil war, and this time, like the cartoon character in Pogo, we have met the enemy, and it is us. The civil war of us against ourselves began in 1930. In 1929, we had a balanced budget. We were the world's banker. All the great nations came and borrowed from us. But in the 80 years since 1930, only one president has really balanced a budget. Eisenhower did it 3 times in the 7 peacetime years of his presidency. No other president has done it. Not Hoover, not FDR, not Truman, not JFK, LBJ, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, not Bush, W or HW, and not Clinton. Well, now, Clinton claims that he and a Republican Congress balanced the budget, but they did it using fraudulent accounting methods that were first devised by Lyndon Johnson.